This is Louise Gay Hendricks interview, take one.
I check my focus real quick before we start.
Sure. Then you.
Louise Hay film, Gay Hendricks interview, take two.
I was 24 years old, and I would say that everything that could possibly be wrong with my life was wrong. I weighed 120 pounds more than I weigh now, and I smoked 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I was in a terrible relationship, and I had a job I hated, and so I couldn't think of much. Oh, I didn't like my car either. So I think just about everything was wrong. I'd always struggled with obesity. I was born, like even by the end of my first year of life, I was very fat as a child, and I was taken around to different specialists and things because my mother and my brother were skinny, and so there was something going on there. And so by the time I was 24 years old, I weighed over 100 pounds, more than I weigh now. So I weighed 300 some pounds. And in addition, all this other stuff was going on too. And so I went out for a walk one afternoon. It was a winter in New England, and I was walking just kind of thinking about how am I going to get out of all of this? How am I going to get out of my life? And I stepped on a patch of ice that had some snow over it, and I didn't see the patch of ice, and I stepped on the patch of ice, and my feet shot out from under me, and I went whoomp down on the back of my head on the frozen road, and I hit myself just hard enough that it didn't knock me out. What it did was it kind of knocked me into a state of consciousness that was like nothing else I've ever experienced before. I was present, but I was also, something else was going on. I was kind of like could see more than I could normally see inside myself. And I think I was laying on the ground for maybe 2 minutes or so. In this 2 minutes, I could see down through all the levels of myself. And I'd never been able to see this before. It was like I saw why my muscles were tense. I saw that I had all of this fat around my body and my muscles were tense, and that all of the fat and the muscles tenseness was there because I had all of these feelings inside me that I had never opened up to, like all these things I was angry about that I'd never told anybody about, and all these things I was sad about that I'd never told anybody about, and things I was scared about. And it was like I could see the level of the meat, and then I could see down in the level of the emotion, and then I could see down underneath everything that there was this clear space that there was nothing kind of written on it. There was nothing there. It was kind of like a spiritual space or an open space with pure potential. And I saw that all of those feelings and all of that tension and all of that fat was there because I was living somebody else's life, basically. And that I wouldn't have that stuff if I had a different life. And what I mean by that is my father had died before I was born. He died while my mother was pregnant with me. And he was very obese, just like I was. He smoked heavily, had probably not a very good relationship with my mother. And I know they had a lot of struggles. And so he died in the midst of, while I was gestating, and so I never actually knew him in the world, but I had sort of taken on his life. That's what I could see down inside myself, that it wasn't even my life. And it was an incredible moment. I think I'd never had anything like that because I always thought this was the reality. This was all there was. And I'd never had a moment of awakening to spirit. And I think that, I always say it is that if you're open, the universe will teach you by tickling you with a feather. But if you're not open, it has to hit you with a sledgehammer. Well, I was so closed that this was like getting hit by a sledgehammer. That was the only way I could learn what I needed to learn, I guess. And so I was in that altered state of consciousness for about 2 minutes, I think. And I began to come back to regular consciousness. I could feel my muscles kind of assembling their tension, and I could feel my awareness of all of this obesity around me. And I could still feel, though, that very sweet, open space down in there, that sweet, open spiritual space that didn't have anything on it. And as I was coming back to regular consciousness, I had these several thoughts that were very different from anything I'd ever thought. One thought was, I'm going to find out what I can do to feel that clear space all the time. And I thought, I'm going to do what I can to find out how to live that way, how to feel that all the time in my life. And the other thought I had was, I'm going to live my own life. I don't have to live my father's life or anybody's life. I can invent my own life. And if that's possible, how do I want it to be? And so as I was coming back to regular consciousness, I made a commitment to feeling that spiritual space all the time, and then to invent a healthy body, basically, and invent a great life. So I make this new commitment to, I really want to learn how to feel spirit all the time, just in ordinary life. And a friend of mine came over to my house one afternoon and said that one of his old Harvard professors had just come back from India and was giving a talk down the road about 30 miles at his father's house. And did I want to come and hear him? And I said, well, what's he talking about? And he said, well, he'd gone to India and he'd kind of gotten enlightened, and he was talking about yoga and meditation. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting, maybe I'll go. And so we go down there, and there is this guy in a robe, a white robe, and there's all these devotees around. And I remember a girl came up and offered us fruit from a fruit bowl, and I was thinking, what is this? Is this some cult or something? Well, it turned out to be Ram Dass, who was Neil's Harvard professor. Under those days, he was named Richard Alpert, and when Neil had taken his course at Harvard, and now he was named Ram Dass. And so Ram Dass had just come back from India, and he was just totally, he was so blissed out and everything. And part of me related to it, but another part of me thought, what are these people selling? I was very cynical about that kind of thing at the time. And so I went up after the talk and asked Ram Dass, I said, look, I got to tell you, I'm very skeptical about this kind of stuff. This looks sort of insane to me, but since I'm here, I just had this experience where I fell on the ice, and I told him the experience. And I said, so I want to learn how to feel that clear feeling in me all the time, just in ordinary life. I felt it for a minute while I was sort of knocked out, but I'd like to feel it all the time without bashing my head on the ice. And I remember he looked up at me for a long time, and just sort of looked at me up and down. And he said, you should do some breathing exercises. And I said, breathing exercises? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? I never heard of anything like that. And he said, well, in India, if you have a problem, you might do some yoga around it or some breathing around it. And it's as valid a way as talking to a therapist about it. And so I said, well, where do you get something like this? And he said, well, just be open to it. It'll come to you. And I said, all right. And so the next day, I was down at the grocery store, and in the checkout line, so I was, pushing my cart up through the checkout line, and they had a little kiosk of paperback books, a little round kiosk of paperback books. And I glanced down, and there is a book called Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation. I'll never forget this, by Jess Stern. And I can see the cover just like it's sitting right here now. And I remember looking at this, okay, Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation. All right, that's interesting. And so I picked it up, and I open it up, and there's an entire chapter on breathing exercises, pranayama. So here I go in one day, from never having heard of something, to Ram Dass telling me, be open to it, to there it is in my hand. And so I bought it. And so I took it home, and I just started doing the exercises all the way through. I remember it was a Saturday afternoon, and my wife and baby were gone to visit her mother, who lived about maybe 40 miles away, and so I had the place to myself. And I just started doing these exercises right out of the book. I would do one and then flip the page and do another one. So I started about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By about midnight, you know, and after doing all of these breathing and yoga exercises and chanting and everything like that, I was in touch with that same space that I'd felt when I bashed myself on the ice falling down. And so there it was, you know, there was a whole different way to get there. I had lost about 75 pounds, so I was sort of, you know, I could feel what could happen, you know, if this actually came true, if the dream really came true. And this friend of mine that I'd known years before showed up for a visit, and he and I were both sort of eating buddies, you know. In those days we would go out for an ice cream sundae or something. We worked at the same place, and we were both obese, and he was still, you know, a 300-pounder, and I'd gotten down to a real slim 225 or something like that, you know. And so he looked at me. I remember I opened the door and he looked at me and he said, "God, what are you doing, you know, and what happened to you?" And I tried to explain this thing that I was going through, and I remember the way he looked at me. And it's probably a lot, you know, it's probably like a lot of people when they start some kind of a change process, the people that are in their lives sort of don't know how to relate to it. And so what he did, this was so bizarre, he went into town and he brought back a 5-pound box of chocolate caramels, which was like the ultimate bad food for me, you know, during that time, you know. And but it was like he walked in the door, and he was a practical joker. I mean, this was partly a practical joke, but I could see the sort of mean edge to it, you know, of kind of wanting to sabotage and wanting to kind of get me to be the way I was. And I realized if I was going to have to, that I didn't have any way to relate to him. And so I basically had to throw him out of my house, you know, leave, please leave. And he did. And what an amazing, 6 months later, I got a call from a friend of mine and said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Ken died. He had a heart attack and died." And he was 26 years old, you know, which was, I mean, and I saw in that moment how that was me. So that was a wake-up moment for me, and a way of saying, life has very serious consequences, you know, choices have very serious consequences. After that year, I moved to California for a few years and went to graduate school. And so over the next few years, I pretty much felt good all the time, and I could see well, and, you know, my weight stabilized and all of that. And I hadn't ever worked out the whole relationship aspect of life, and I continued to have kind of one relationship after the other of, you know, they'd get to a certain point and then they would fall apart. I would usually start finding fault with the person, or the other person would find fault with me, and we'd never be able to work beyond a certain point with our relationship. And so one magic day, I remember setting the intention of, oh, I learned how to see. I learned how to be an okay weight. I learned how to live healthy, free of addictions. I learned how to eat well. How come it didn't occur to me that I could do that with loving? You know, it had never occurred to me that I could actually design my own life around love and relationships. And so that was a big revelation to me, the idea that the same process could work. And so I began to work with this idea of enjoying a flow of love in my life, and that love comes to me. I don't have to pursue it. And as I began to work with that, I had this other amazing insight. In fact, I was walking down the street in San Francisco, I remember, in downtown San Francisco, with a woman that I'd been with for a year or so, and we always had the same complaint with each other. her complaint about me was that I was not in touch with my feelings and that I never communicated about anything important, that I never would talk about the real stuff, you know. And I, of course, had my defenses against that, you know, that I forget what they were, but I had my good justification for why I didn't talk about my feelings and didn't talk about things that were important. My complaint about her was that she was super critical. And so whenever she would get going with me about, we never talk about anything important, or you're never in touch with your feelings, I would say, well, I would be if you weren't so darn critical. You know, and it would get us into this loop then. And I was walking down the street with her in San Francisco, and I realized, I don't know where this insight came from, but I suddenly realized that, oh, I create that. I'm the one that creates and has created my life so that I'm in relationship with a very critical person. And up until that moment, I thought it was their problem, that I just happened to have the bad luck of always ending up with a critical woman. And so I remember stopping on the street kind of to think about this, and she said, what's going on? And I was kind of trying to share this insight with her. And she wasn't having any part of it, by the way. She was not buying my little insight at all. And so the other awareness that I had in that moment was that the very thing that I complained about all the time, and this is true for everybody, I think, that the very thing we complain about over and over is the very thing that we're creating happening. In other words, we got this loop going of not realizing that we draw certain experiences into our life and then going around complaining about that all the time. So anything you complain about repetitively is something that you have an unconscious intention to produce. And so that hit me like a ton of bricks. I suddenly realized, oh, I require a critical woman in my life. That's me dreaming up that dream. And my next thought was, well, I think I'll dream up a better dream. You know, I'll dream up a dream of being surrounded by loving and supportive people. And that was really a big moment for me because nobody in the history of my family that I know of has ever had a successful relationship besides me and Katie. In other words, up until that moment, my parents had a disastrous relationship. My grandparents, just about everybody, everywhere I looked in the family, was full of people who either they had a very kind of like a routine relationship, they went through the roles, certain roles, or they managed to stay in a long-term relationship through the regular application of vodka and other kinds of things that allowed them to stay put, you know. So I realized that it would be breaking absolutely radical new ground if I was able to create a relationship that worked, that would be an unthinkable thing to do. And what better thing to make happen, you know, than something completely unthinkable. And so I sat down on the floor of my apartment at the time and designed what I wanted in a close relationship in my mind. And honesty, a relationship where both of us were free to pursue our creativity, our creative callings, and that each of us took full responsibility for our lives so that we didn't get into blaming each other. So if something came up, we would just say, why did I create that, you know? And so I remember saying to the universe at the time, that's what I want, and if it's not in the cards for me to have that, I'll be alone. I'm fine with being alone, but I promise I will never settle for less. And I think that little thing I said at the end kind of cracked the whip. You know, I said, that's what I'm about here. And so from that moment, it only took a month until Katie came into my life. And one of the great moments of my life was my first meeting with her, because she came up to me to ask me a question. I was actually giving a seminar at the graduate school where she was getting her PhD, and she was also one of the instructors there at the school. She was the movement therapy instructor and taught some of the classes there, and she was also getting her PhD. And so she came up to ask me a question during this seminar I was giving. I don't remember what the question is to this day, but I said to her, "I'm very attracted to you. I just want to let you know that." And I said, "But I also want to let you know that I'm only interested in relationships where both people speak honestly to each other, and both people take responsibility for their lives, and both people are committed to their creativity. And on those terms, would you like to have a cup of coffee with me?" And it was kind of I mean, I'd never said anything like that in my life. You know, it was a totally outrageous thing to say, especially given the context of what was going on. And so I remember the look on her face. She kind of went like this. You know, it's like cogitate, cogitate, compute, compute, does not compute. And suddenly she said, "Okay." And I can do that. And so, you know, that was our first meeting and basically set the tone for our whole last 27 years together.